On April 14th, 2023, I went to my first Magic the Gathering pre-release. Attending a pre-release event was something I really wanted to do after hearing how much fun it is to test drive a brand new set with players of every skill level. And I had such a great time. I won 2 out of my 3 matches that night. Not bad for a noob like me. The set I attended pre-release for, March of the Machine, was an expansion I was really looking forward to because it featured cameos and revisits to settings from Magic's 30-year history. At the time, I was drafting an editorial about storytelling techniques found within trading card games, particularly Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! However, the more I wrote about Magic, the more I realized I had much more to say about the game, the storytelling devices it uses, and its 30th anniversary. So, here we go. This is my experience with Magic's story as a newbie. As a writer, I've learned that human beings have a natural urge to tell stories. We are compelled to share our experiences in order to teach, imprint, and connect with each other. Our stories may take many forms as well, from the traditional oratory practices of world mythology and folklore, the books of poetry and prose lining the shelves of your local bookstore, to the lyrics of your forever favorite songs. Narrative and storytelling can be found everywhere. Magic the Gathering isn't any different, as the game's story is told through its cards. There are 2 key areas in which narrative is told through the game pieces: the artwork and the flavor text. To illustrate how these 2 vehicles work together, let's take a look at the Lhurgoyf. Lhurgoyf was a card originally printed in 1995 for Magic's Ice Age expansion. Artist Pete Venture's original illustration depicts a necrotic monstrosity writhing about in a snow-covered forest. Beneath the card's rule text, there is a quotation that reads, "Ach, Hans, run! Is it Lhurgoyf? Safi Eriksdottir. Last words." In 10 words, we learn that the Lhurgoyf is something to be feared and the ultimate fate of Safi Eriksdottir. In isolation of this card, however, we do not know who Safi Eriksdottir or Hans are, what their relationship to each other is, why they were out in the wilderness that day, and if Hans survived the encounter with the monster. This is where Magic's nature as a collectible card game gives them a unique advantage. They are able to save scenes and story pieces for other cards. 3 years after Lhurgoyf's first printing, in the text box of Revenant, we would see a very familiar name pop up again. Given the card's context and seeing how its effect is similar to that of Lhurgoyf, we can assume that Hans survived his escape and is balking at this new creature. In 2006, during the Time Spiral expansion, we received another piece of lore with the first printing of Safi Eriksdottir's very own card. Safi's original illustration, depicted by Christopher Muller, shows us the character running away from the Lhurgoyf, looking behind herself in horror. Safi's flavor text reveals to us that she outran Hans, and he was trying to catch up. We would receive the final pieces of the story with the printing of Hans Eriksson's own card, as well as a reprint of Safi. Both cards illustrated by Ryan Pankos for Commander Legends and Time Spiral Remastered respectively. In Hans's card, we see him stopping to smell some flowers, unaware of the disfigured shadow casted over him. It is here where we learn that Hans and Safi are actually siblings, both being children of Eric, and that Hans lost Safi while escaping. What I love about Pankos' new art for Safi is how we tied everything together. From the consistent character design of Safi, look at the details of her hair, her dagger, and her circlet, the long shadow of the Lhurgoyf imposing upon her, and the figure of Hans running the opposite direction. These all culminate into a complete representation of one of Magic's oldest side stories. And Magic is filled to the brim with these cards contributing incidental anecdotes to the game's multiverse. Though these depictions of lore may not relate directly to the game's actual story, they do help to make its many worlds and settings feel lived in. From Granite Gargoyle's flavor text mentioning the infernal chef Asmarana Markadaisis Koudelka and her underworld cookbook, to Sarah Angel introducing us to the beloved Sarah, Magic's story excels in providing fan service through sequential art. I can't believe I said Asmarana Markadaisis Koudelka in one take. That's amazing. Essentially, sequential art is a storytelling device that uses images presented in a specific order in order to convey a cohesive narrative. The most popular example of this is found in comics. In his definitive work, Understanding the Invisible Art of Comics, Scott McCloud recounts the term which was originally given to us by the legendary cartoonist Will Eisner. Taken individually, the pictures below are merely that, pictures. However, when part of a sequence, even a sequence of only 2, the art of the image is transformed into something more, the art of comics. Ultimately, Magic's narrative relies on context and timing to effectively tell its many tales. The presence of a singular narrative did not exist in Magic's earliest sets. Cards in Alpha, Beta, and Unlimited depicted loosely connected scenes in both their artwork and flavor text, mainly referencing the plane of Dominaria and the characters Urza and Mishra. Magic's first true set expansion, Arabian Nights, was an adaptation of the 1001 Nights Arabic folklore collection. This is the collection where the stories of Aladdin and Sinbad originated from. It is within this expansion set where the two modes of Magic story and gameplay design were originally conceived. Wizards of the Coast research and design team approached set design with either a top-down or bottom-up approach. A top-down design approach begins with a focus on subject, whereas the bottom-up design approach begins with a focus on mechanics. In episode 427 of his Drive to Work podcast, head designer Mark Rosewater elucidates the difference between the two modes of design.
So approach number way is you can have a subject matter. Like you can say, okay, I want to do this piece of art. What am I going to do it on? I want to do a piece of art on Nelson Mandela. Wow, how could I capture Nelson Mandela? I really would like to capture his face, and maybe I wanted some sort of three-dimensionality to it. Oh, you know what? Maybe I'll make a clay bust of Nelson Mandela. The second way is a tool-based thing, where you say, I'm going to make something. I feel like clay. I'm going to make something out of clay. Ooh, what can I make out of clay? Oh, maybe I'll make a bust of Nelson Mandela.
It is important to stress that one of these models is not superior to the other, because one set may need to start with the story and another may need to start with the mechanics. They are simply starting points, and whether starting from the top or the bottom, sets will eventually meet in the middle with their stories and mechanics established. To illustrate an example of top-down design found in Magic the Gathering, let us examine the infamous Shahrazad card from Arabian Nights. The revised Oracle text of Shahrazad reads, "Players play a Magic subgame, using their libraries as their decks. Each player who doesn't win the subgame loses half their life, rounded up." In other words, everybody stops playing Magic in order to play another Magic game, stalling the main game's progression. This cleverly captures Shahrazad's role in the 1001 Nights. In the collection's framing narrative, Shahrazad volunteered to marry a king who had a propensity of beheading his wives the morning after they wed. Every night, Shahrazad would captivate the king with stories of high adventure, intrigue, and fantasy. However, she would always stop halfway through the telling of these tales, saving both her story's ending and her own life for another night. In many ways representing the archetypical trickster, the literary Shahrazad reveals to us the life-saving power of storytelling. Reflecting on the card's gameplay mechanic, however, it's obvious why this card is banned in every format it is playable in. Imagine having a full playset of Shahrazads in your deck and playing every one in a single game. You'd be playing 5 layers of Magic. Annoying, but definitely in the spirit of the character. Another thing we learned from the literary Shahrazad is the effectiveness of long-form storytelling through small, interconnected tales. Something that should sound familiar at this point in regards to Magic. The sets that followed after Arabian Nights did not share any direct continuity with each other until Ice Age and Alliances were introduced, and maybe Homelands depending on who you ask. It wasn't until the release of Mirage where we see Magic intentionally group sets to work mechanically and thematically with each other. With the release of Mirage, Visions, and Weatherlight came the introduction of Magic's iconic 3-set block design, where an initial large set was followed by 2 smaller supplementary sets that all shared the same core mechanics and flavor. This level of player immersion was unparalleled, as the player was invited to spend an entire year in a specific plane and indulge in the unique flavor it brought to the game. 1 year could be spent with the ninjas of Kamigawa, and another year could be spent in the gothic horrors of Innistrad. Unfortunately, the 3-set block model has been retired and was replaced by the quarterly individual sets we see today. Though the excitement and immediacy of visiting a new plane or returning to a familiar one is great, these settings become transient and fleeting. It is the difference between going on vacation to Tokyo for a week and living in Japan for a whole year. The latter, allowing you the time to settle and understand the culture, while the former makes you cram in an entire itinerary that you feel like you didn't have enough time to do everything you wanted to do. 俺は日本が恋しいです. It is also easier to define specific eras of Magic with whatever block was in rotation that year. If I said Tarkir block, a veteran player may associate that year with the 3 Tarkir expansions and the 2014 to 2015 Pro Tour season. As of the writing of this editorial, we will soon return to the planes of Eldraine and Ixalan. But when will we return to New Capenna or the neon future of Kamigawa? Without the focus of a multi-set block model, we are not afforded the time and attention to fully immerse ourselves in these worlds and their lore. And that's what I feel like Magic's design has been lacking. The courage to stand in the face of our culture's dependency on instant gratification and commit to give new settings the time they need to fully develop. I haven't seen that in the last few sets. Where Magic's story could have truly benefited from the 3-set block model was during the last 2.5 sets. Phyrexia All Will Be One, March on the Machine, and March on the Machine The Aftermath. Considering that it was the game's 30th anniversary, Wizards missed the perfect opportunity to revisit their beloved release model as a callback to the game's history. Unfortunately, this cycle of releases made the narrative feel rushed and insignificant. For context, the new Phyrexian invasion of the multiverse was a major event that was in the making for the past 2 years since the release of Kaldheim, when the Phyrexian Praetor, Vorinclex, had a new card printed. The other 4 Praetors would make an appearance in the next few sets, establishing their presence on other planes like Lurking Shadows. All Will Be One served as the perfect first act of the conflict, setting the stage for the invasion and seeing fan-favorite characters become corrupted by Phyrexian completion. March of the Machine showed us the Phyrexians invading the planes of the multiverse, giving us some incredible moments of fan service through the new battle cards. Through this invasion, we revisited popular planes such as Dominaria, Ravnica, and Innistrad, but we also returned to some really obscure planes like Chandalar, Olgrotha, and Xerex. We also saw legendary team-up cards where iconic heroes of various planes partnered with each other to combat the mechanical horde. This is probably the only place where you'll find a vampire riding a dinosaur. On top of this, March of the Machine reprinted legendary creatures from Magic's history who were actively combating the Phyrexian invasion. Not only did this Multiverse Legends bonus sheet give us reprints of fan-favorite characters in brand new planar-style treatments unique to the worlds they originated from, but also expanded upon their lore like we saw with the 2 Sappy Eriksdottir cards. March of the Machine should have solely focused on the Multiverse Invasion's second act, building up the tension and uncertainty if the planes would be able to overcome these insurmountable odds. However, the inclusion of Elspeth's ascension as an Archangel and her absolute yeeting of Elesh Norn in the set is narratively problematic, as the defeat of the Phyrexians lacks gravitas due to pacing. We don't even have to look far for a narratively stronger solution. March of the Machine The Aftermath is Magic's first epilogue set. This micro set of 50 cards showed the fates of key characters and planes after the invasion. Despite Aftermath being a non-draftable set of 50 mechanically unique cards, Wizards of the Coast still released a full product line of booster boxes, bundles, and collector boosters. I think I know where Wizards was headed with Aftermath, intending to release the trading card equivalent to video game DLC. But with that analogy in mind, isn't the entire growth of Magic as a game been a series of optional content? Aftermath feels less like an expansion pack for The Sims, something that added value and significant content to the base experience, and more like a $100 furniture pack for The Sims 4. I desperately want to believe that if Wizards of the Coast treated Aftermath as the story arc's third act properly by waiting to include Elspeth's Transcendence, Elesh Norn's Banishment, the Multiverse's Triumph, and the event's epilogue, not only would the story's pacing would have been cleaner, but also the issues surrounding the set could have been avoided. If March of the Machine The Aftermath was a proper set, it could have been named something unique like Multiverse Legends The Final Stand, and could have easily have taken the place of the upcoming Lord of the Rings, or even better, the Wilds of Eldraine set. Not to throw shade at Eldraine, I'm actually really excited to visit that plane for the first time, and it looks like Sir Ginger the Mule Ender will be my next commander. But why do I say Wilds of Eldraine could have been pushed back? Because players could have been left in suspense, having to wait past the Lord of the Rings and Commander Master sets before the grand conclusion of this major story arc. It could have built hype and speculation around the story. March of the Machine story chapters on Magic's official website could have had the time to focus on these legendary team-ups instead of fighting for the spotlight with Elspeth. Furthermore, if this hypothetical third set were to release in autumn 2023, it would have been a perfect narrative conclusion to Magic's 30th anniversary, which began with Dominaria United in September 2022. I can't think of a better way to round out 30 years of Magic the Gathering than what could have been a 3-set block celebrating the end of a major story arc. And I know that the sets from this anniversary event were intended to be somewhat of a 4-set block, but Dominaria United and the Brothers War both feel so far removed from what could have been Multiverse Invasion block. The MTG Weekly livestream officially unveiling Aftermath was an awkward mess. Blake Rasmussen, the head of Wizards PR, was accompanied by Emily Tang and Roy Graham, both of whom are significant lore keepers for Magic's story. As the 3 presenters went over the entire 50-card set, It was clear that both Tang and Graham were not prepared to discuss story elements of the new epilogue set. I want to stress that this is not a slight against the two writers. They were both obviously stressed during the livestream, having to witness the chat who was overwhelmingly and rightfully criticizing Wizards for the Pinkerton situation. Watching how Rasmussen was responding to the chat, it is clear that Wizards is aware of the community backlash, and knowing that, they should have chose brand managers to handle the livestream, personnel whose job is to know the product and communicate with the public. Regardless, seeing both Tang and Graham struggle to answer lore questions is indicative that March of the Machine was rushed, and Aftermath would have been a better set to properly conclude the Phyrexian story arc rather than making a microset. Tang, who literally had her story published on Magic's website that day, especially should have been more prepared to answer questions for the characters she wrote about. Where's Ajani? What happened to Nahiri's blade arms? Why doesn't Sarkhan have green mana in his color identity anymore? These are all questions that the chat brought up and were not satisfactorily answered. The presenters sometimes responded with vague clues stating that they did not want to spoil the story. But that circumvention does not work when the Martial Machine story has already concluded and this microset's only purpose was to tie up loose ends. As someone who is fairly new and greenhorn to this hobby, I feel like I started my journey with Magic during a very awkward time. Since the release of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, I've been immersed in the game's culture, watching and reading as much content as I could, from the fun and poignant editorials to Tillerian Community College, the incredible video essays of my fellow Coheed and Cambria fan Ristic Studies, ICSM, to the absolute chaos of the Command Zone. However, hearing the numerous questionable business decisions Wizards made during the game's 30th anniversary was disheartening, to the point where I was completely absent for Brothers War and All Will Be One. When I heard that March of the Machine was going to revisit all these different planes from Magic's past, I was definitely interested and decided to attend the set's pre-release event at my closest game store that was hosting it. It was during pre-release where everything clicked in for me. My first match was with Jacob, who had been playing, as he said it, pretty much since the beginning. My second match was with Steven, who was an incredibly technical player and was kind enough to give me some pointers after he beat me 2-0. My third match was with Alex, who was very similar to my skill level. We even played similar rule decks, making our set feel like a mirror match. During our tie-breaking round, I was finally able to play my bomb, Vorinclex, to the oohs and ahs of the other players at our table. Alex was immediately able to remove my threat with a series of instants, which was such a good play on his part. After I had collected my prizes for the night, I had a moment to reflect and realize that despite the bad press and reputation that follows the game, Magic's community is why the players stay. As cheesy as it sounds, Magic is all about the gathering, the meeting of people from every background and skill level who come together to enjoy a single shared passion. Yes, Wizards can bombard their consumer base with a deluge of new products. They can make their big anniversary celebration product prohibitively expensive for the majority of their players. And they can, but absolutely should not have, strong-armed one of their fans into returning product he had purchased. Wizards may make the cards, but the players are the ones who make Magic and keep the game alive. Here's hoping that the next 10 years will be kinder for Magic the Gathering and its fans, both new and old.